Hello and welcome to Cask to Glass, the whisky podcast, where I examine the heritage and flavour of Scotland's national drink and the world's favourite spirit. In this episode, I talked to Drew Mackenzie Smith from Lindores Distillery, where it all began. Well, Drew, thank you very much indeed for talking to me today.
It's a pleasure.
Before we get rolling, how do you take your whiskey?
I take it if it's cask strength, I take a wee drop of water. If it's not cask strength, I have it just as it comes.
And if you had to pick one whiskey in the world to drink, what would it be?
Well, I would say my own whiskey, but if the MCDXCIV isn't available, I really like Old Pulteney. We used to live up near Wick for a wee. Lindores has always been home, but our work took us all over the place. And I think often with a dram, it's where you have it and who you have it with, etc. And so I really like an Old Pulteney. A wee bit salty, but I love it.
You're bang on, aren't you? It's all about where you are, who you have it with. Tell me about Lindores, because am I right in thinking this is the oldest? This is where it all began, or it's one of them?
Yeah, it is. It's a story I've told quite a lot over, as you can imagine, over the years. But it's regarded as we're linked to the earliest written reference to the production of Scotch whisky, and I'm always very upfront about that. It's the earliest written reference, right? Because there's no evidence of when aquavitae was first made, but we're tied in with the Exchequer Roll of 1494, and I suppose that the ground zero was the Scotch whisky industry celebrated their 500th anniversary in 1994, kind of saying, right, if there's any more, forget it. And because the second earliest was the Guild of Surgeon Barbers in 1496, and if it had been the other way around, that would still be Lindores Abbey Dairy and not Lindores Abbey Distillery. So that's the way the world is.
It's to do with Friar John, isn't it? Just explain to people that story, or who he was.
Yeah, well, the sort of abridged version of how all this happened was our family have been here since 1913 and just merrily getting on with our day-to-day life. And then in 2001, a chap knocked on the door of the house, which is adjacent to the farm, and asked my father, do you mind if I go for a walk around the Abbey? And don't forget, the Abbey had cattle in it. I used to drive motorbikes in it, and we didn't really look after it perhaps as we should have. So this gentleman knocked on the door, asked if he could go for a wee wander around the Abbey. Dad thought, knock yourself out, thought it was a bit strange. Thought no more of it, and then several months later, a book arrived in the post, which I still have there. A book arrived in the post called Scotland and Its Whiskies. And on the flyleaf it said, Dear Ken, thank you very much. Turn to page 170. Turn to page 170, and there's a lovely photo of the Abbey ruins. And the chapter is entitled, For the Whisky Lover, It is a Pilgrimage. So we're kind of scratching our heads thinking, why is it a pilgrimage to walk around our back garden? And the gentleman written about walking around the Abbey saying a silent but happy Dionysian prayer of thanks to Friar John Core of Lindores Abbey. And again, we're scratching our heads thinking, well, still don't know what he's on about. And so then it became my job, I suppose, to say, well, who is Friar John Core? Basically, what it led us to is to the Exchequer Roll, which still exists. There's very little that exists of Lindores, thanks to John Knox. There's a very pretty ruin, but there's no paperwork and things like that. And so the Exchequer Roll does exist because it didn't live at Lindores. And I have had the privilege of seeing it in the museum in Edinburgh. And it's a 30-yard long vellum scroll written in Latin, falling apart. And basically it's all the transactions of the royal household of that year. So it's wax, linen, all sorts of stuff. And there's one wee entry, and even when the expert in his white gloves is kind of pointing where I should look, it's still pretty hard to read, but translated, this one line is to fry a John Core, 8 bowls of malt, wherewith to make aqua vitae for the king. And then and no one knows. I mean, I've got a great debt of gratitude to who first discovered that. I don't think anyone's sort of lost in the mist of time. And Friar John Core was a Tyrrhensian monk of Lindores Abbey.
Mm.
And so, yeah, so that was where we kind of found out about it. And we thought, well, it's a nice thing to find, but it brings with it a sort of burden. And but that visit, and I should mention that the chap who had visited was Michael Jackson, who, again, we weren't a whiskey family. I didn't know who Michael Jackson was, but he was, I think, arguably the leading whiskey and beer writer of his day. And I think that's when the whiskey world thought, well, if Michael Jackson is saying this, because we had no idea, then we should take it seriously. So that knock on the door in May 2001 is a direct starting pistol for me sitting here today.
What did you do then?
Well, it took a long time because then the industry was not in a great place. The only reason we knew that, funny enough, I say we're not from a whiskey family or anything like that, but my wife Helen and I had somehow stumbled into high-end hospitality. And at the time, we were running Cadboll House, which is a great property that Glenmorangie owned. So we were kind of aware that things weren't great in the industry. So I thought, well, how do we get this idea even out there and to get people to notice? And as I was a chef in those days, and one night after service, I thought, well, why don't I go online? In the early days of the internet.
Yeah, I was going to say, was the internet up and running? But
yeah,
it was.
It was creaking. We were just about got there.
Okay, crawling.
And I thought, well, who do I speak to? And so I thought, well, I'll look for whiskey clubs, and alphabetically, the one at the very top of the list was Anne Quaich from Canada. And I thought, well, here's nothing. And actually, I was really just saying about this revelation and thinking of kind of turning one of the sheds in the farm into a wee museum or something. So I sent that email, and then at some point in the next 48 hours, got this response from Anne Quaich, and it was the most fiery support. We've still got the hard copy of it. So, we'll set fire to the heather, you name it, we'll do it, etc., etc. And I thought, wow, if that's sort of enthusiasm. It took me a wee while to sort of slightly work out the time lag, etc. And I suspect this response was sent maybe at 10 or 11 at night after a few drams, because it was so flowery and passionate, which was great. But that is what, following on from Michael Jackson's thing, that sort of made me think, well, if people at the other side of the world are thinking there should be something at Lindores, whether it was a shed or a distillery and things like that. And the really nice thing is the chap that wrote it is still the president of Anne Quaich. He's now about 75, 80. And they were over here a couple of years, just pre-COVID. And I was saying, well, again, that you're partly to blame. I was thanking him, but whether I was pleased or not, but no, it was great. And that's what kind of got us going. And then it was a case of just trying to drum up interest. But as I say, I got a lot of very encouraging letters and all sorts of vocal support, which was great, but not much money. And you can't build a distillery on enthusiasm. And it got to the point that actually, after a few years of banging our heads against the wall and continuing to work in hospitality and things like that, it really got to the point we thought, it's not happening. So just that's Célavy. We've given it our best shot. And then a friend in the industry who had been very involved to try and drum up interest got back in touch. He said, look, there's all these new distilleries opening up all over Scotland, which I wasn't aware of because, again, I wasn't reading the whiskey press. And he said, look, the one place there should be, in his opinion, was Lindores. And he said, have you still got the trademarks? And I said, yeah. So it was a Carpe Diem, seize the day. And hung up the call and thought, well, I better check I still do have the trademark. And turned out I didn't. I'd let it lapse, the trademark for Lindores, because if it wasn't happening, I didn't need the trademark. And the trademark's only a couple of quid. Well, it's a couple of hundred quid, but I'd obviously let it lapse. And so I thought you could just renew it. So renewed Lindors, and then got a very stern letter from the lawyers of Lindt Chocolate, who have the Lindor Bunny, which, to be absolutely fair to them, is a luxury product, very similar sounding name. And I thought, oh God, because without the trademark, it's going to be a bit of a problem. And I was advised by friends and said, well, you can't go head to head because you'll lose. So I went back to them and said, look, I get it. I like Lindt. I like your chocolate bunnies and all sorts of stuff. I said, but come on, give me the Abbey was built by the brother of the king. It was founded in 1191, and I'm sure we can come to some understanding. Forgetting, I was Joe Public and there was a barrage of lawyers. But the reason I say all this story is to be absolutely fair to Lindt. They did agree. They agreed that as long as I wouldn't make chocolate truffles with Lindor's single malt in it, they would allow me to use a trademark. So, I always thank them for that kind of generosity, because they could have actually said, you may never be a threat to us, and we never will be. We're in different walks of life. But so luckily, then armed with the trademark, I managed to march forward. But the other bit of luck, the bit of luck was 1191, the place being built, Friar John Core, great-grandfather buying it in 1913, and all these things, just happy coincidences and things like that. But sometimes you make your own luck. And when I'd had discussions with Glenmorangie, because that was the obvious first port of call, and their take was, well, for the creatives, they loved the idea of Glenmorangie getting involved. What none of us knew at the time was that was when Glenmorangie was for sale. So actually the bean counters and the owners thought it wasn't the right time for them. But they did, the constructive advice was, the thing is, okay, you've got the trademark for Lindors, but you need both sides of the coin. You need Friar John Core as well. And I didn't have that trademark. And then one day, and this is where the sort of good fortune and whatever else comes into it, I was on the radio, and Paul Walsh, the ex-chairman of Diageo, was on the radio. And it just caught my ear that he was talking about that he felt the responsibility of the industry was to preserve the history, etc. And so I managed to get his email address, and I said, well, I've just heard you on the radio. How about Lindors? If I'm honest, never expecting to hear anything back, and I wouldn't have moaned if I didn't. But pretty quickly I got a thing back from his office, etc. So, well, actually, we could have a talk about that. And to their absolute credit, Diageo transferred Friar John Core to me, so it sits alongside Lindors, and that's why it's one of the reasons that we've never been a small distillery who kind of presses against the Pernod Ricards of Diageo. Right. I think a lot of our business now is in China, for instance. Well, that wouldn't have happened if Diageo hadn't broken down those doors. So I'm an admirer of that.
So given this happened, and you get some money in, start building or digging holes and to build a distillery, did you find anything that you thought this goes back to Friar John?
Well, we did. Ironically, it was a complete surprise. So basically, long story short, is we had to, because of the Abbey, as you can imagine, and even though the farmsteading has been here since 1850, we had to do a lot of archaeology before we could start pulling the place down, which was absolutely fair. And I was sure we wouldn't find anything. The very first thing was when we started pulling the walls of the farm down, we found all these finely carved stones which would have been pillars. So there's lots of unanswered questions, so that's great. And our bottle shape is modelled on those pillars. Why they were buried in the walls and hidden from sight, we can only guess.
We can only guess.
We can only guess. My thinking is that you certainly weren't meant to be nicking stone, because all this came from the monastery. So the rough-hewn stone wasn't overtly religious. I suppose these things that were obviously part of the monastery maybe were. We've got a good relationship with Historic Environment Scotland, so they are technically treasure trove. And I managed to persuade them, because they're important at Lindores. With all due respect to my stones, or our stones, they're not important anywhere else. So if they had gone into a warehouse, then no one would see them. So they very kindly let us keep them. And so we display them and we look after them. And we've got a great relationship because they've seen that we can look after things. So that was a nice thing to find. And then we carried on. So with the archaeology, we then had to dig 14 very deep trenches around the back of the farm. As I said, I was convinced there would be nothing there. And we had to have, as part of the plan, an on-site archaeologist throughout the whole process. And Rebecca, she's great, very, very good at her job. So the first day that the diggers come in, put the first trench in, we find a wall, which is amazing, a wall that's been buried for several hundred years. Also, it was a part of the farm that had obviously never been arable, because literally this was about a foot below the surface. And we've got lots of photos of all these things. And so that was a huge excitement. And then day 2, Rebecca comes over. So day 3 or 4 of finding walls, the excitement was kind of teetering over into panic. Stop finding walls, please. So we had to record every single stone, which is great. And there's a whole very detailed, you'd have to be a pretty seasoned archaeologist to want to wade through all of it. But the pictures look lovely and it's all preserved. So that was that. And then almost the last bit you have to do on a build like this, or if it's a number of houses, etc., is a suds pond, which is not a glamorous thing. It's just for overflow water from the buildings. And because of these trenches, we knew, well, I thought I knew where, okay, this is where we put the suds pond in, there's nothing there. So again, the JCB comes out and starts digging. And then Rebecca comes across again and everything ground to a halt. And we'd found what we thought was like the top of a well, the top of a medieval well, because it was a red sandstone that we have everywhere else, circular, and it was full of water. So we thought, well, this is great. We've found a medieval well. What we'll do with it afterwards, we'll have to wait and see. So then Rebecca, supervised by a more senior archaeologist who was fortunate on site that day. Some of the she was at work a lot with. Mm-hmm. So we take out the water, and actually it's a clay-lined bowl, and everyone's scratching their heads. And then I think it was Rebecca or the other turned around and said, this looks like a still, or rather a kiln that a still would have sat upon.
Yeah.
And so we thought, wow, that's something else. And so we then had it, I think it's called flot tested, which is a scientific way. And basically there's carbon, there's barley in there. So it's a really frustrating thing. It's the most amazing thing to find. But because it's from, well, I'm not saying 1494, it was from, who knows where it was, how far it dates back. But the general, very strong belief is exactly that. It's a kiln upon which a still would have sat. Now, to find that anywhere is amazing. To find it at Lindores is even more so.
Yeah.
However, where it gets tricky is normally in these things, if someone discovers something that dates back as far as that, you hit books, you hit the internet, you see what you can find out. And of course, there's nothing like it. So the advice was to, we would say we strongly believe it to be this object. What strengthened that, funnily enough, more recently was, I don't know if you read about is it Glen Turret that had an original that moved site. Now I hope I'm talking about the right distillery. It was Glenfarclas. Anyway, it's one of the bigger, older, very much older distilleries.
Hmm.
In fact, arguably the oldest current, I think maybe the oldest working. So, but it moved about 100 yards, 150 years ago or something. But what they recently discovered was the original still room from the original distillery. So you're
Wow.
dating back a couple of hundred years.
Yeah.
And when I saw that, it absolutely redoubled my belief and our belief of what we have, because you can see the layout was similar, albeit 400 years more
Wow.
modern.
Wow. Wow.
So yeah, to find that what we do at the moment is it's covered up, it's tarpaulin over it because obviously it's fragile. We're working with do a lot of work with St Andrews University, archaeology, etc. Is we quite it's not a massive project, but it's like everything else, it's expensive and things like that, is to try and make it so people can come and view it, but not walk on it because we
Right.
could damage it. You know, we do a lot about preservation at Lindores, and I would feel very, very sort of strongly that we'd not fulfilled that promise if the first, you know, if A, we've dug it up, and then the next thing we've sort of not treated it well. My guilt about digging it up, fun enough, is less. I don't know if you've ever been down to Vinlandia on
I certainly have on
Hadrian's. Yeah,
Hadrian's Wall. Yeah, I have.
amazing place.
Stunning.
Yeah,
Unbelievable. 2,000 years old.
I know, and a really a humbling experience for me, apart from anything else, because I'm always banging on about how advanced our Tyrrhenensian monks were in 1191, and they were, to be
Yeah.
fair, advanced. And then you go to Vinlandia,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Well,
another,
they have a whole sewage system for the whole town.
yeah.
We could talk history the whole day, but I mean, you've got this amazing distillery. I presume people from all over the world come, and you sell all over the world. Just describe the distillery and the whiskies you make, and how that all kicked off.
Yeah, I was very lucky in that because my project started in 2001, there was a long time before the distillery was built and we were producing spirit. And so I'd had 10 years of free advice from Jim Swan, Dr. Jim Swan, who was a great friend. And then when the project became real, he became a friend and a consultant. So he was a paid consultant. So we did a lot of work with Jim to establish, well, what sort of spirit are we looking for? We are a lowland distillery, although partly, bizarrely enough, where we are on the Tay, there's a little bit in the Highland, but we're a lowland distillery by all accounts. But we didn't want to be, I don't really buy into there's a light lowland spirit anymore. That
Mm.
used to be the
Yeah.
case. There's several distilleries. We're all doing different stuff now. So we did a lot of work with Jim about still shape and still size, which obviously then predicates how our spirit will come. The distillery itself was, again, lucky through Jim's contacts we used Forsyths, who, in my opinion, sort of Rolls Royce of still makers. And Jim, yeah, it was costly because one of the things I'd said to him is, look, because of the weight of history, the spirit has to be good. You know, and I know there's no guarantees that the spirit will be good, but I'll find the money somehow to give you what you need to do that. And so we'd had a lot of conversations with Forsyths, and it was going to be with production looking at about 250,000 litres per annum.
Right.
So to do that, most distilleries would have one spirit still, one wash still. That was the plan. Um, and then Jim came in one day, having been at a different distillery that had one wash still, two spirit stills. And as I've said, I've never built a distillery before. And Jim started saying, well, try this new make spirit. This is some of the best new make spirit I've had. And he was sniffing it and doing all this kind of stuff. And it was great, don't get me wrong. And eventually I said, well, why are you going on about it so much? And he said, well, do you remember the promise you made me about finding the money? And my heart sank a bit. I thought, oh, God. I said, but I've got to keep my word. And I very naively thought, so his point was the distillery had, as I say, one wash still, two spirit stills. And I very naively thought, well, two small stills probably cost about the same as one big still. I was a couple of decimal points wrong on that. However, the day that our new make spirit was voted in the World Whisky Awards. It was the best Scottish new make. So I thought, that money was worth spent because for me, a big distillery and a small distillery, your new make is your DNA. And if that's not working well, you can have the best casks you can ever imagine, and it's not really going to pan out. So with that great new make spirit and Jim's contacts in the cask world, which again was very important, you have to have premium casks. I love the way it worked out that his main supplier, the bourbon cask down in Louisville, and he said to us one day, right, you guys have got to get down to Louisville. And this is halfway through a meeting, the distillery wasn't even built. And he said, no, you've got to get down to Louisville. So great, we're delighted to head down to Louisville, but we've got a few bits going on. And eventually said, no, you get your visas and get down there. And the reason being, one of his other clients was a fantastic Kavalan distillery in Taiwan, which is far bigger than Lindor's. And the whole point was that the guys from Kavalan were heading down to Louisville. They said, if they get there before you, they're going to clean the place out. And I always had this vision of Dad's army and the flags across to Louisville. But what I really liked was the fact that he was saying, look, you can send 1,000 emails about casks and this, that, and they said, the way these guys work, they want to meet you, look you in the eye, shake your hand, and then you've got a contract. Because the way it works, well, certainly for us, I can't speak for others, is it is done that way, because one year we'll need 1,000, next year 2,000. You don't know how to, you can't commit or overcommit, because as we're all sitting here now, I think there's a general perception that the industry's not in a strong place, just because of the way the world is. I mean, that was before tariffs reared their head, but that's another thing. So with those good casks and good new make, we are producing award-winning whiskey. Our main whiskey, I kind of regret this a wee bit. We got talked into, we were going to call it 1494 for obvious reasons. And then some smart, well, actually, I say the marketing department, we are the marketing department, had this idea of doing that in Roman numerals. And you'll know very well that MCDXCIV is 1494. But it doesn't quite roll off the tongue. But it sticks in people's minds. So we do that. That's our core thing. And then we've got quite a few good sort of cask finishes. One of the nicest projects we started 2 years ago, or it reached the market 2 years ago. So our monks came from Tiron in France, Tiron-Gardais, lovely little village, 60 miles south of Paris. We've been over there a few times. Their monastery still exists because they didn't have John Knox. And it's quite a rural part of France. And we had this idea, well, look, wouldn't it be a nice idea to get some casks made of Tiron oak? It was an experiment. So it's French virgin oak, not something we've done. So we thought we'll commission a few. It's a lovely story. If it doesn't pan out, it'll never see the light of day in a sense. But after a couple of years in the cask, we thought, well, this is actually working really, really nicely. So we commissioned umpteen more casks. So we're now doing an annual Tiron release, which we launched in Tiron itself. So it's a nice thing. As I say, it keeps the link between Lindor's and the Mother Abbey going, which goes back, well, since before 1191. So it's quite a nice dram with history attached.
It's a great story. Where are you selling? I mean, all over the world. What's your biggest market?
All over China at the moment.
China?
Ironically, we had a slow start in America, just not necessarily picking the right partner and things like that. So when we talk about tariffs, we're not really exposed in America. Having said that, this was going to be our year to get exposed in America. So we'll maybe just put the brakes on that a wee bit. But looking east is good at the moment. But with everything that's going on, never mind tariffs. There's so much going on in the world. It's hard to hedge your bets. What's happening with China.
Yeah, I feel as though you and I could talk all day about this, but it's a great story, isn't it? And that's the beauty of whiskey is there's legacy with it, isn't it? There's a story. It's Scottish. There's a background.
Yeah.
And your distillery is right in there.
Yeah, no, we're super lucky. All our barley comes from the fields round the distillery, with everything within a mile. So we like to think, in a way, we're growing the barley in the same fields that Friar John Core got his 8 balls of malt back in 1494. Our water comes from a borehole, using the same sunshine. So no, it's all about history for us, but the whiskey has to match the quality of the history. Otherwise, it would just be a bit of a Loch Ness Monster scenario.
We're never going home. We're never going home. Can we stay with you in Scotland for the rest?